Okay, Jesus Dojo, we are going to be looking at parables. And as you follow Jesus through the Gospels, as you sit at His feet and learn about the way He went about making disciples, you cannot miss the fact that He taught in parables. And in Mark 4, we see this. So He tells a series of parables about the kingdom of God. But I'm going to pick up at the last one and then take a quick look at an important little caveat at the end of the passage that we're going to zoom in on. So again, he said again, so this is in the end of a series of parables that he shared. What shall we say the kingdom of God is like? Or what parable shall we use to describe it? It is like a mustard seed, which is the smallest of all the seeds. Yet when planted, it grows and becomes the largest of all the garden plants, with such big branches that the birds can perch in its shade. With similar parables, Jesus spoke the word to them, as much as they could understand. He did not say anything to them without using a parable. But when he was alone with his own disciples, he explained everything. So two quick things here. First of all, we're not going to look at, we're not going to hear the teaching about what this parable may have meant or had, explain what the mustard seed and the branches and the kingdom of God. We're not going to look at that. Remember, in the context of Jesus Dojo, we are looking at the actions that Jesus takes, the way that he went about making disciples. And we see something very interesting at the end of this passage. So he tells this parable, but then interestingly enough, he goes away with the disciples, and the text says that he explains everything to them. So with the crowds, he just kind of let it sit there. He tells this story and just kind of lets it marinate and hang there without giving them a full explanation or understanding. But then with the disciples, later, he explains in detail what it means. He gives them understanding. Now, the second little piece that we need to look at there is looking back to the relational spaces about what Jesus pours in and expects from the crowds of disciples of 12 and 3, about how he looked briefly about how they are different, about how he poured in different things based on the relational space that he was operating in. Well, we see that very clearly in this text. To the crowds, he taught in parables. To the disciples, he explained everything. Why? Why did he do this? What was he doing with this approach? And I'm not here to give you the answers. You need to continue to process that, think about that, and incorporate that into your understanding of your disciple making and discipling in relationship with Jesus and with others. All right? But why did Jesus teach in parables? That's what we're going to explore here, and hopefully make that a little clear, and then give you a task or a challenge at the end for what you need to be doing as a Jesus Dojo if you're going to be following Jesus in this area of parables. So, a parable was a story or a illustration or an analogy in our modern context or language that revealed the things of God alongside everyday life experience. And he would put them together in a way that allowed the person to not have an immediate answer, not to be expected to have the right answer, but to live inside the story connected to their everyday lives in a way that revealed a piece of God's relationship with them. And he did this through parables, through story, through a spoken word. Now, this is very important for us to understand. We're going to do a brief history lesson to help understand why Jesus took this approach. So, way back here at the dawn of time, whenever you think that may be, way before Christ, human beings lived in what we'll say is an oral culture. They presented, processed, and received and then reproduced information verbally. That's what we mean by an oral culture. If you think about that, they would sit around campfires, they would sit in their houses, and they would speak and they would tell stories in a way that they could remember. their brains processed information differently. There's stories about little kids, like 7, 8 years old, knowing the entire Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Kids being able to orally reproduce that information themselves as 7 or 8-year-olds. Fascinating to think that. But that was because, in part anyways, importance of their culture, but in part because that's just how they processed information. They just did. And so it was much easier for them to do. Well, for a very, 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 very long time, culture itself, the world itself, processed information in that way, orally. And so we put like Jesus here. So Jesus was living in the heart of this oral culture. So when Jesus was doing this, it was an intentional discipleship move for him to reproduce the way of God into his culture. It wasn't just that he liked telling stories, although stories have a place in our heart, as we see that we still tell Jesus stories here 2,000 years after his life. But he was doing this in a way that communicated to them that they best processed information. And that is extremely important for us as we talk about making disciples. The reason that Jesus used this approach was because he was reproducing his life or the way of God into other people. Not just simply to tell good, lasting stories. It was an intentional discipleship move. But that also had a lot of benefits of not giving it an answer, but allowing them to own faith themselves. To explore these stories in a way that's not that you had to have the right answer, but that allowed deeper levels of meaning to come and flow out as they experience life. For example, this mustard seed thing. Like, we kind of get it on a certain level. Yeah, God's kingdom is small, but then it's big, and we understand that. But then as you really begin to process, as that person that heard that original parable would have went about their life and then actually saw a mustard seed or a mustard plant and then ate the seeds that come from that, they would have had these different levels of understanding and interaction with this story, a parable that made God's kingdom become more real and more true for them as they went about living their real life. And that's really important. So about 1600, something really, really important happened called the Gutenberg printing press. I think it was actually in the 1500s, but when the shift really happened in culture, where it became a written culture. So this is the printing press, a pivotal moment in history. Because then people began to move from an oral culture to the written culture. So we could reproduce, process information differently, because now we had mass text. So we could print off thousands and thousands and hundreds of thousands of different or the same text so that we could all share it and experience it together. We didn't have to only rely on oral culture anymore. That's why we had magazines and books, and we processed information in that way. And for 400 plus years, that is how we went about reproducing and making disciples. We did it through texts, through books, through learning, through lectures that accompanied texts, that accompanied books that taught us about Jesus. Well, around 2004-ish, we'll just say that the internet completely changed how we process information. Now, we are not oral, we are not written, we are a visual or image-driven culture. We now process information through the lens of imagery. And the illustration that your Jesus Dojo leader should have put you through is putting this on the board. So what is this? What is this fundamentally? Fundamentally, it's 3 different circles. Poorly shaped circles. But all of us, when we see that, we immediately have a different level of meaning. We have a different level of meaning that we bring to it called Mickey Mouse. So we have 3 circles. We have Mickey Mouse. then we can all tell a story out of this about when we either went to Disneyland, or that we saw a movie and it impacted us, or a dress that we made or that we wore as a young princess, or playing as a kid as one of these heroes of the Mickey Mouse story. So we have a story to tell. But then we have tangible experiences, like we actually went to Disneyland, or I remember sitting in this chair and watching this movie, or I remember the cover of the art of Pinocchio. So out of this one image, there's a whole subset of meanings that is produced and created out of this. And that is where we are at now, is where Jesus told parables to reproduce his life through oral culture. We are now in a new territory. And as disciples of Jesus, we need to really be processing how we can come up with, as a community, a set of images that help us engage with the story or way of Jesus. And so your task as a Jesus Dojo community tonight is to begin to contextualize this idea of parables. So think about all the benefits and reasons for why Jesus would have spoken in parables, but then transfer that into images, and then come up with some experimental images as a Jesus Dojo that you can begin incorporating into your discipleship and disciple making that will help one another learn the way of Jesus. So Godspeed in that, and good luck, and I can't wait to see what you guys come up with.